In the heart of West Virginia, hidden away in a town barely known to outsiders, there exists a story that both terrifies and fascinates. The Whittaker men, bound by bloodlines that run too close, have become infamous for their genetic legacy. A family that has lived in seclusion, their lives a complex web of hardship, isolation, and genetic tragedy. How did a family of men become a symbol of one of America's darkest secrets? What drove them into this unbreakable cycle? The Whittakers are not just a family. They are a stark reminder of a time when poverty, isolation, and genetic fate intertwined. They embody a legacy so tragic that it lingers like the mist that wraps around their mountain home. The question remains, are these men victims of their circumstances, or are they the inevitable result of a history written in blood? Let's explore the depths of their world, a world where survival comes at any cost, and every step forward is a battle with fate itself. If you're intrigued by this haunting story and want to uncover more of the hidden tales of America's forgotten corners, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others. We've got many more untold stories to explore together. Don't miss out. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there exists a town so small it's barely known by outsiders. Odd, West Virginia, is a place where the world outside feels distant and unreal. The Whittaker men have lived there for generations, and their story, both tragic and haunting, began long before most could remember. Odd's isolation made it a world apart, untouched by the usual conveniences of modern life, a place where neighbors were few and survival depended on the strength of your family. The Whittakers had always been part of this rugged community, though their name carried with it an unease that others couldn't quite explain. The Whittaker family, though known in Odd, kept to themselves, their lives shrouded in mystery. The house they lived in stood alone at the end of a winding road, crumbling with age, a remnant of another time. The men of the Whittaker family never left the town, their bloodline intertwined for generations. The town's residents had come to expect nothing different. The stories they whispered about the Whittakers had a dark edge, tinged with something the townspeople couldn't quite define. Though small and tucked away, Odd was a town that whispered. And as the fog rolled down the hills, the name Whittaker often hung in the air, a reminder that some secrets were better left untouched. Life in Odd was harsh. The rugged mountains and unforgiving weather made every day a challenge. The Whittaker men, like many families in the area, lived off the land. They had little choice but to survive. But in doing so, they unknowingly set the stage for a legacy of genetic tragedy. Henry and John Whittaker, two brothers, were at the heart of it all. They had been raised in the same world, a world where survival was everything. The harshness of life bound them together in a way few could understand. Their bond would become the foundation for everything that followed. The two brothers, though not identical, were inseparable. Their bond seemed unbreakable, forged in the fire of hardship. They worked together, lived together, and faced the challenges of Odd side by side. In a world defined by scarcity, this connection was essential. The Whittaker men made their way through life by relying on each other. The idea of a larger world outside Odd seemed distant, unnecessary. The mountains provided for them, and the community was close-knit. In this secluded corner of West Virginia, the Whittakers were just another family trying to survive. But as the years went by, Henry and John's choices began to shape a darker future. With few people around, the bonds between them and their relatives began to intertwine in ways that were not always healthy. The isolation of Odd meant fewer options for marriage, and soon, the Whittakers began marrying within their own family. It started innocently enough, but over time, the shared blood between cousins, uncles, and nephews became a tight knot that no one could undo. The family tree, once a source of pride, began to twist and tighten, becoming something dangerous. This cycle of intermarriage, driven by necessity more than choice, set the foundation for a series of problems that would affect generations. The Whittaker men didn't see it as something abnormal. For them, it was a survival tactic in a world where their options were limited. By the time the third generation of Whittakers came into the world, the consequences of their ancestors' choices were becoming painfully clear. The shared blood that ran through their veins began to reveal itself in ways that could not be ignored. The men born into this tangled web of bloodlines suffered the effects of generations of isolation. Physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and strange behaviors became all too common among them. The town, though keeping its distance, began to whisper louder. The Whittakers were no longer just a family. They were an enigma, a mystery that most in Odd could not fully understand, but knew too well. The men of the family lived in a state of near-constant hardship. The mountains around them seemed to mirror their struggle. As the years wore on, the Whittaker men became symbols of the town's isolation. Though Odd had many families who faced their own challenges, none were as consistently marked by such a strange and tragic legacy. The story of the Whittakers had become folklore. In Odd, it was said that the Whittaker men didn't just live differently, they existed in a way that blurred the line between tragedy and something else entirely. Their very existence was a question no one dared to answer. The family's reputation was sealed, and as the fog settled over the town, whispers about the Whittakers lingered in the cold mountain air. The Whittaker men had lived in this place for as long as anyone could remember, but their story was still just beginning. The truth about the Whittakers, buried in the shadows of Odd, is one that few dared to confront. But the cycle they began would have consequences that reached far beyond their isolated mountain home. The legacy of their choices would leave a mark on the world. In a town so secluded where every day felt like the last, the Whittaker men carried the weight of their decisions. Their story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of genetics, isolation, and the unintentional consequences of choices made long ago. The town of Odd would always remember the Whittakers, not for their success, but for the tragedy that followed them. Their name would live on in whispers, a reminder of the dangers that come when survival is the only thing that matters. This is where the Whittaker story begins. A tale rooted in the harshest elements of the Appalachian Mountains, it would unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. The men of this family would face challenges no one could have foreseen. Henry and John Whittaker were not just brothers. They were bound by something deeper, a connection that extended far beyond family. The bond between them was forged in the harshest elements, built on the shared struggle to survive in a place where isolation was the norm. Born into poverty and seclusion, the Whittaker brothers knew little of the outside world. The Appalachian Mountains, which surrounded them, provided a constant backdrop to their lives, a reminder that survival was a daily task. From a young age, the brothers understood that they had to rely on each other. The mountains could be unforgiving, and the challenges of daily life left little room for weakness. Together, they were stronger. Together, they could face whatever came their way. Their bond became the foundation of their existence. They worked side by side, tending to the land, building what little infrastructure they could, and ensuring that the family could survive the harsh winters and rugged terrain. Though they were not identical twins, Henry and John shared a striking resemblance in their dedication to their family. Their goals, ambitions, and struggles were all aligned, forming a unity that few could understand outside the confines of Odd. The brothers, despite the hard life they led, managed to make a name for themselves in Odd, though not always in the ways they would have hoped. The family became known for its resilience, its ability to endure, but there was more to the Whittaker brothers' legacy than just hard work. The isolation they lived in meant that options for marriage were scarce. The town of Odd, already small, had even fewer men than women. The brothers' choices became limited. In a small town like Odd, familial ties meant everything. The brothers soon found themselves marrying relatives, cousins, nieces, even more distant blood relations, hoping that these unions would help preserve the family's future and ensure survival in a challenging environment. At first, their choices seemed harmless, even necessary. The tight-knit nature of Odd, coupled with its distance from the outside world, made it difficult to consider marriage outside the family. This limited pool of possible spouses would eventually become the catalyst for the family's darker legacy. Henry and John's children grew up with similar challenges. Isolated from the rest of the world, the brothers' sons married within the family, continuing the cycle. What seemed like a logical choice at the time would soon show its consequences. As the generations passed, the Whittaker men's marriages began to intertwine in ways that would make outsiders shudder. The same bloodlines were repeated over and over again, creating a dangerous genetic cocktail. The closeness of their blood relations set the stage for troubling results. The Whittakers family tree began to twist and turn in unnatural ways, with relatives marrying others within their own family. The cycle of intermarriage, driven by necessity, eventually became an inescapable pattern. Despite the mounting challenges, the Whittaker brothers never considered breaking the cycle. The practicalities of life in Odd overshadowed any awareness they might have had about the dangers of inbreeding. It was survival, pure and simple. As Henry and John grew older, the consequences of their actions began to manifest in their children. The oddities, physical deformities, and strange behaviors were more than just unfortunate accidents. They were the results of generations of genetic mixing. Though their family's struggles became more pronounced, the Whittakers still considered themselves survivors. They believed they had no choice but to continue the cycle, seeing it as the only way to endure in a world that had long forgotten them. The brothers' legacy, however, was already set in motion. With each passing generation, the Whittaker men grew more deeply tied to one another. The family bond, once a symbol of unity, now carried a darker weight, one that would follow the family for decades. The effects of the brothers' choices rippled through the family, touching every corner of their descendants' lives. Those who were born into this cycle carried the mark of their ancestors' decisions, a reminder of the tangled web that had formed around them. Odd, once a simple town nestled in the mountains, became the home of a family whose story would be told and retold, a tale of survival, isolation, and the dangers of bloodlines too close. The Whittaker men had unknowingly set a tragic course for their future. As the Whittaker family grew, so did the recognition of their situation. The town of Odd, small and isolated, began to take notice of the growing oddities and strange behaviors. Though many stayed silent, they knew the family's legacy had taken a dark turn. In the quiet hills of Odd, Henry and John's decisions still echo. Their bond, once a source of strength, became a tragic symbol of the consequences of isolation and the dangers of choices made long ago. The Whittakers' legacy was sealed. The brothers had unknowingly laid the foundation for a tragedy that would span generations. Their bond, while once a source of strength, would eventually become the chain that kept the family trapped in a cycle they could not escape. In the secluded hollows of Odd, the Whittaker family continued to grow, unaware of the devastating genetic consequences that loomed just around the corner. The repeated marriages within the family, once considered a necessity, began to manifest physical and mental effects. The men of the Whittaker family, born into this cycle, showed signs of genetic deformities from a young age. Intellectual disabilities, physical abnormalities, and strange behaviors became more noticeable as the generations continued. The consequences of isolated living were becoming evident. As the family tree twisted further, it became increasingly clear that the Whittaker men's genetics had become a tangled web. The same bloodlines were intertwined over and over again, leading to a deepening of inherited traits. Those born into the family began to suffer the effects of inbreeding. Ray, one of the most well-known members of the Whittaker family, showed signs of mental and physical challenges that were a direct result of the genetic issues running through his bloodline. Ray's behavior was one of the first signs that something was wrong. His speech, often guttural and unintelligible, was the product of a mind shaped by the unfortunate genetic ties within his family. His life would become a representation of the tragic consequences of the cycle. Lorraine, another well-known member, exhibited strange behaviors as well. Though part of the same genetic spiral, her existence was marked by the same challenges that Ray and others in the family faced. They were all bound together in a fate they couldn't escape. Timmy, another Whittaker male, carried the same scars of his lineage. His strange actions, including barking at strangers, further illustrated the depth of the family's genetic problems. The cycle of inbreeding had left its mark on every branch of the tree. The odd behaviors and physical deformities weren't the only issues the Whittaker men faced. Their ability to communicate was severely limited. Ray's guttural grunts and strange mannerisms were all symptoms of the genetic disorder that had ravaged their family. The isolation that had once served as a means of survival now became a curse. The town of Odd, already a place of few neighbors, had become the breeding ground for a family whose bloodlines were slowly destroying them. The Whittaker men, however, continued to live as they always had. The harsh conditions of the land and the relentless passage of time hadn't softened their resolve. They carried on, even as their bodies and minds betrayed them. Locals in Odd began to take notice of the Whittakers' condition, though few dared to speak openly about it. The family's reputation had become one of strange, unsettling tales that floated in hushed tones through the streets of the town. The Whittakers, despite their struggles, were part of Odd, and Odd, in turn, had become their protector. The town, tight-knit and cautious of outsiders, rallied around the family in an unspoken agreement to keep the darker aspects of their situation hidden from the outside world. Odd's community, deeply loyal to the Whittaker men, grew protective, as if shielding them from the outside world could keep the secrets buried. Their loyalty to the family was steeped in both fear and respect for the tragedy that had befallen them. As the years went on, the Whittaker men became symbols of isolation. Though many townspeople may have looked upon them with pity or concern, the family's survival seemed to carry a sense of pride, no matter the toll it took. The Whittaker family's house, a crumbling shack at the edge of town, became a place that few outsiders dared to approach. It was as if the very structure itself had become a part of the family's tragic identity. In the distance, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The Whittaker men continued to live, their world small and isolated, and yet their story seemed destined to touch others in ways they could not control. It wasn't just the family's genetic condition that set them apart, but their place in Odd itself. The town had become a reluctant witness to the family's decline, as the Whittakers' struggles seemed to mirror the hardships of the land itself. The Whittaker men's lives were defined by a cycle that felt inevitable. The decisions of their ancestors had set them on a path that no one, not even the brothers Henry and John, could have foreseen. The genetic consequences were becoming too pronounced to ignore. As the years passed, the Whittaker men continued to live with the legacy of their past. Their struggles, both physical and mental, were a constant reminder of the toll that isolation, survival, and the unintentional consequences of their choices had taken. In the fog-covered hills of Odd, the story of the Whittaker family remained one of tragedy. It was a tale of survival, yes, but also one of a bloodline too close, a legacy that would forever haunt the mountains they called home. The town of Odd, small and isolated, existed in a world that seemed frozen in time. While the rest of the country moved forward, Odd remained untouched, its residents bound by a history they could not escape. For the Whittaker men, Odd was both a blessing and a curse. The isolation that had once protected them from the outside world now became a prison, trapping them in a cycle of inbreeding and genetic decline. Odd's few residents kept their distance from the Whittakers, though their isolation was far from unnoticed. The community, with its tight bonds, knew of the Whittakers' struggles, but few dared to speak openly about them. The men of the Whittaker family were known in Odd, but they were seen through a lens of quiet discomfort. Their behavior and appearances were a source of whispered conversations among the townspeople. Yet, the family's presence remained unquestioned. The town, steeped in its own traditions, valued secrecy. Odd was a place where outsiders were viewed with suspicion, and the Whittaker men were no exception. Despite the family's strange existence, the town chose to protect them. Odd's protective nature toward the Whittaker family wasn't out of sympathy, but rather out of fear and loyalty. The family had lived in the town for generations, and the people of Odd had come to view them as part of their identity. Over time, Odd's secrecy surrounding the Whittaker men became more entrenched. The town's residents, bound by shared hardship, shielded the family from the prying eyes of the outside world, fearing that exposure might bring unwanted attention. The bond between the Whittaker family and Odd was unspoken, but undeniable. Though the townspeople may have whispered behind closed doors, they would never dream of abandoning the Whittakers or revealing their story to outsiders. For many in Odd, the Whittaker men had become symbols of their own struggles. The family's isolation mirrored the hardships faced by the town itself. Both were forgotten by the outside world, their stories relegated to the shadows. As Odd remained hidden in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, the Whittaker family's presence was a constant reminder of the cost of survival in such a remote and unforgiving place. Their plight became intertwined with the town's identity. The harsh realities of life in Odd, where poverty and isolation were a constant, made the Whittaker men's struggles seem almost inevitable. The town's residents, facing their own challenges, found a strange kinship in the Whittakers. Odd was a town that kept its distance from the world beyond, but the Whittakers, despite their tragic situation, had become inextricably linked to its identity. They were no longer just a family. They were Odd, and Odd was them. Despite the oddities that defined the Whittaker men, the town of Odd remained steadfast in its protection. Outsiders who dared to inquire about the family were met with suspicion and coldness. The town's secrets were not to be shared. The Whittaker men's home, tucked away at the edge of town, became a symbol of their isolation. Though it stood in disrepair, it was a place where the men lived and died, their lives marked by the harsh conditions of their existence. The story of the Whittaker family, though whispered among the residents of Odd, was never fully told. The town's refusal to acknowledge the darker truths of the Whittakers' lives allowed the family to remain shrouded in mystery. Odd's deep loyalty to the Whittaker men was born of a shared history. The town, scarred by its own hardships, had formed a bond with the family that was difficult to break. In the mountains, survival was a collective effort. The Whittaker men, despite their struggles, remained an integral part of Odd. Their lives, marked by isolation and tragedy, became symbols of the town's resilience. In a world where survival was uncertain, the family stood as a testament to enduring hardship. As the years went on, the town of Odd continued to shield the Whittakers from the outside world. The family's strange existence, though acknowledged, was allowed to remain hidden from those who might judge or exploit them. The Whittakers, with their tangled bloodlines and tragic legacy, became a part of Odd's soul. The town's decision to protect them was not just about loyalty, it was about survival. In Odd, the Whittakers were as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. The Whittaker men lived lives that were defined by their isolation. Their world was one where survival took precedence over everything else, and the difficulties they faced were far from ordinary. Life in Odd had shaped them in ways few could understand. Each man of the Whittaker family carried the weight of his lineage on his shoulders. Ray, Timmy, and the others, each with their own struggles, embodied the legacy of a bloodline marked by both tragedy and resilience. Ray was perhaps the most recognizable of the Whittaker men, his struggles with communication and behavior a reflection of the genetic issues passed down through generations. His grunts and unintelligible speech were a part of his existence. Timmy, like Ray, carried the scars of his ancestors' choices. His behavior, strange and erratic at times, was a direct result of the family's history of inbreeding. His actions left others in awe, both puzzled and saddened. Despite the challenges they faced, the Whittaker men never wavered in their desire to survive. Each day they fought to keep going, despite the physical and mental toll of the family's genetic issues. Their lives were a testament to endurance. The Whittakers' home, though decaying, was a symbol of the family's persistence. It stood as a reminder of their refusal to leave Odd, to abandon the town that had watched them endure hardship for so long. Though the Whittaker men were seen as tragic figures by outsiders, in Odd, they were simply part of the landscape. Their struggles were part of the town's shared history, a constant reminder of the harshness of life in the mountains. Despite the peculiarities of their lives, the Whittaker men had a sense of pride. They survived, even when it seemed impossible. Their struggles, though painful, were their own, and they endured because they had no other choice. Ray, who had become the face of the Whittaker family's plight, was never truly understood by those around him. His mental and physical challenges defined his existence, but he remained a part of Odd, accepted despite his oddities. Timmy's life, like that of his family, was marked by a deep sense of isolation. His strange actions, including barking at strangers and acting out, were the result of the genetic legacy he had inherited. He had little understanding of the outside world. The other Whittaker men shared similar challenges. Each one was a product of the family's tangled bloodlines, their lives shaped by the isolation and genetic consequences of their ancestors' choices. Yet, they never gave up. Odd, the town that had watched the Whittakers endure for generations, had become a place where the family's struggles were simply part of the landscape. The men of the Whittaker family were an ever-present reminder of the price of survival. While outsiders may have seen the Whittaker men as tragic figures, in Odd, they were survivors. Their presence, though odd and unsettling, was a part of the town's identity. The Whittakers had lived through more than most could imagine. The Whittaker men were often seen as an enigma in Odd. Their lives, though full of hardship, were a testament to their resilience. Even as their bodies and minds were shaped by tragedy, they kept moving forward. Despite the toll of inbreeding on their health, the Whittaker men never gave in. They kept going even when the odds were stacked against them. Their survival was not just about endurance, it was about the will to live. Each day in Odd was a struggle for the Whittaker men. Their lives, marked by isolation, physical deformities, and mental challenges, were a reflection of the toll that survival had taken on them. Yet, they continued. For the Whittaker men, life was a battle against circumstances they could not control. The genetic legacy that had been passed down through generations had left its mark, but it had not broken their will to survive. Though their lives were shaped by tragedy, the Whittaker men carried on. Each man, in his own way, embodied the struggle of survival in a harsh world. Their story was not one of surrender, but of enduring hardship. The Whittaker family's legacy was marked by both tragedy and resilience. The men, despite their struggles, had never given up. In a town like Odd, where survival was the ultimate goal, they had done just that. Survived. The Whittaker men's lives, though tragic, were also a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Despite the genetic challenges they faced, they carried on, living day by day, driven by a will to survive that could not be extinguished. The legacy of inbreeding within the Whittaker family had far-reaching effects, impacting both the physical and mental health of the men. Their struggles, a direct result of generations of tightly knit bloodlines, were undeniable. As each generation of Whittaker men was born, it became clear that the family's isolated nature had caused genetic issues that could not be ignored. Mental and physical challenges became an inevitable part of their lives. The most visible sign of the Whittaker men's genetic struggles was the series of physical deformities. Ray, Timmy, and others displayed traits that were unmistakably linked to inbreeding, a cruel inheritance passed down through the generations. Intellectual disabilities were just as prevalent among the Whittakers. Ray's guttural speech and inability to communicate clearly were the result of a genetic lottery that left him unable to fully function in the world around him. Timmy, too, struggled with his mental capacity. His behaviors, often erratic and unpredictable, mirrored those of his relatives. Though his actions were strange, they were simply manifestations of the genetic challenges he had inherited. The physical deformities were harder to ignore. Oddities in the Whittaker men's appearances, such as disfigured limbs or distorted facial features, were evident, the results of generations of close intermarriage. These features were part of their identity. The cycle of inbreeding, though initially a survival mechanism in a community so isolated, had become a curse. With every generation, the damage grew more profound, and the Whittaker men bore the consequences of their ancestors' choices. Though many outsiders might have viewed the Whittakers with pity, to the men of Odd, these physical and mental issues were simply a part of life. The family's struggles were accepted, even if they remained largely unspoken. The Whittaker men's condition was a biological consequence of isolation. With no other family to marry, the cycle of inbreeding was perpetuated, and the genetic defects became more pronounced with each passing generation. There was no escaping the impact of the family's genetic history. Even as the Whittakers tried to survive in Odd, their bodies and minds were betraying them, the result of choices made long before they were born. Despite the toll inbreeding had taken on their bodies and minds, the Whittaker men never stopped pushing forward. They survived because survival was all they knew, even as their health continued to decline. The genetic issues that plagued the Whittakers were not just physical, but mental. The family's limited cognitive abilities made it difficult for them to understand the full scope of their predicament. They were trapped in a cycle they could not escape. Odd, though small and isolated, had become home to a family whose genetic struggles were becoming increasingly apparent. The men of the Whittaker family, no matter how hard they tried, could not escape the effects of their bloodlines. Despite the challenges, the Whittaker men never gave up. They continued to live their lives as best as they could, refusing to allow their genetic issues to dictate their survival. They were driven by an unspoken determination. Even as their health worsened and their abilities became more limited, the Whittakers kept on. Their survival, while tragic, was a testament to their willpower, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. The inbreeding that had shaped their lives had consequences, but it didn't destroy their desire to live. Each Whittaker man, though facing immense challenges, carried on because survival was all they had ever known. The legacy of the Whittaker men was one of hardship. The toll of inbreeding was evident in their lives, but despite the physical and mental challenges, they fought on, surviving against all odds. Their story was one of resilience. Odd, with its small, tight-knit community, had become a place where the Whittaker men's legacy was both a tragedy and a reminder of the cost of survival. Their lives were marked by a history they could not escape. The Whittakers' fate, shaped by the genetic consequences of inbreeding, was sealed long before they were born. But despite the challenges they faced, the Whittaker men survived, their existence a testament to the human spirit's resilience. When filmmaker Mark Lee turned his camera toward the Whittaker family, the world was introduced to a story that many had kept hidden for years. His documentary shed light on their isolated lives in Odd. Leah, driven by a desire to document forgotten stories, believed the Whittakers' plight was one of tragedy that needed attention. Yet his work sparked intense debate. Was it an act of compassion or exploitation? As the cameras rolled, the Whittaker men, unaware of the global attention they would soon attract, continued their lives as they always had. The family, despite their challenges, was never prepared for the exposure. Mark Lee's intention had been to tell a story of hardship and survival. However, as the documentary gained traction, questions began to surface. Was the exposure of the Whittakers' lives a step toward understanding or a breach of dignity? The Whittaker men had lived in Odd for generations, untouched by the outside world. But once the film was released, their privacy was shattered. The townspeople, too, were drawn into the story, reluctant participants in the unfolding drama. Though Leah had intended to bring awareness to the Whittaker family's struggles, the documentary quickly took on a darker tone. Viewers began to question the ethics of filming people who may not fully grasp the extent of their exposure. The Whittaker men, living in isolation, were unprepared for the global attention they received. The film brought attention to their lives, but it also raised difficult questions about the responsibility of filmmakers in such situations. Leah's work, though shedding light on the family's plight, had unintentionally turned the Whittaker men into subjects of public scrutiny. The world saw them as an anomaly, a family trapped by their genetics and their isolation. The community of Odd, though protective of the Whittaker men, was forced to confront the growing interest in their town. Leah's documentary had brought outsiders into their quiet world, and they were unsure how to react to the attention. The ethical dilemma surrounding the documentary deepened as the Whittakers' story spread. Were the filmmakers merely exposing a hidden tragedy, or were they exploiting the vulnerability of a family who didn't fully understand the implications? The documentary's success left a lasting impact on the Whittaker family. What had once been a family living in relative obscurity was now a subject of global fascination. The men, already burdened by their struggles, had no choice but to face their new reality. Odd, a town that had always kept to itself, was now thrust into the spotlight. The men of the Whittaker family became symbols of a hidden tragedy, their lives laid bare for the world to see. As the documentary gained popularity, so did the debate over the Whittakers' exposure. Some argued that it was important to share their story, to shed light on the harsh realities of rural life. Others felt the film was an intrusion. For the Whittaker men, the world beyond Odd had never been a reality they could understand. Yet, once their lives were broadcast to the masses, they found themselves caught in a whirlwind they could not control. The documentary, though well-intentioned, raised uncomfortable questions. The Whittaker men, their lives already defined by hardship, now had to contend with the consequences of being turned into a spectacle for the world to observe. Odd had always been a place where the Whittakers could live without interference. But once the film exposed their struggles to the world, the once hidden corners of their lives were now open for scrutiny. The Whittaker men, isolated for so long, were now at the center of a debate they never invited. The line between exposing their suffering and exploiting it became increasingly blurred as the documentary's impact grew. Though the filmmakers had hoped to bring awareness to the Whittaker men's plight, the reality of their exposure was far more complicated. The family's personal struggles became fodder for public consumption, their dignity now called into question. The aftermath of the documentary left the Whittaker men in a strange position. They had never sought attention, but now they were the subjects of it. The family, once isolated and protected, had become symbols of a tragedy that felt too intimate to expose. In the end, the Whittaker men's story became both a symbol of survival and a reminder of the ethical lines that can blur when documentary filmmaking meets vulnerable subjects. The world had witnessed their lives, but at what cost? Though their challenges were many, some of the Whittaker men, like Brandon and his son Braxton, began to show signs of breaking free from the cycle of hardship. They represented a potential escape from the family's past. Brandon, unlike many of his relatives, showed ambition beyond survival. He had dreams of escaping Odd, of finding a life that wasn't bound by the genetic legacy that had marked the Whittakers for generations. Braxton, young and filled with a natural curiosity, embodied the possibility of change. His bright eyes and unburdened spirit were a stark contrast to the struggles of the Whittaker men who had come before him. Though their future was uncertain, there was a quiet sense of optimism in Brandon and Braxton's lives. They represented the potential for the Whittaker family to break free from its tragic past, though the path was unclear. Brandon's ambition to leave Odd was a powerful force. It was not just about escaping the town, but about finding a life where the burden of his family's legacy didn't define his every action. Braxton, still young, had not yet been shaped by the weight of his family's history. He carried no burdens, only possibilities. For him, the future was an open road, and his dreams had not been crushed. Though the Whittaker family's story had been one of isolation, hardship, and genetic tragedy, the presence of Brandon and Braxton hinted that the cycle could be broken. The future did not have to be bound by the past. But the mountains of Appalachia were not kind to those who sought change. Even for Brandon, the world outside Odd seemed like a distant dream. The town's isolation was a heavy weight, one that would not easily be shaken off. Odd had a way of holding on to its residents, especially those like Brandon, who had been born and raised in its isolation. The community, though protective, was also a place where escape seemed almost impossible. Despite the obstacles, Brandon remained determined. He knew that to escape the cycle of hardship, he would have to leave behind everything he had known. It would be a difficult journey, but it was one he was willing to undertake. The presence of Braxton, young and untainted by the past, gave Brandon hope. Perhaps his son could live a life free from the genetic burden that had shaped so many of his ancestors. The future was still unwritten for him. For Brandon, the idea of breaking free was more than just a dream. It was a necessity. If his family was ever to escape the curse of inbreeding and isolation, it would have to start with him and Braxton. Though the Whittaker men's legacy was filled with tragedy, it was also marked by their unyielding determination to survive. Brandon and Braxton's story, though still in its early stages, could be a new chapter in that legacy. As Brandon and Braxton looked to the future, the world outside Odd seemed both inviting and daunting. The challenges they would face would be unlike anything the Whittakers had ever encountered before, but they were ready to face them. In a town where survival was the only law, Brandon knew that the only way forward was to break free from the constraints of Odd. His escape was not just physical, but emotional and psychological as well. The road ahead was uncertain, but Brandon and Braxton's desire for something more gave hope to the Whittaker family's future. The past may have defined their present, but it did not have to define their future. Brandon's journey was one of courage, a willingness to confront the legacy that had haunted his family for generations. His determination to build a better life for Braxton was the spark that could ignite change. As the Whittaker family's story continued to unfold, the hope for a new chapter became more tangible. Brandon and Braxton, though facing immense challenges, represented the possibility of a future that was different from the past. The story of the Whittaker men was one of survival, yes, but it was also one of possibility. As Brandon and Braxton looked to the future, they carried with them the hope that they could break free from the chains of history.